I really appreciate the chance to get to speak to y'all, and especially in this building, which is going to be in the presentation, because they would probably... Kate says she doesn't have a hook to get me off stage, but I feel like if I didn't talk about the monument, she would just, like, push me out.
On stage.
Oh, push me out. Right. She'd be like, we have plenty of pictures. It's fine. But it is a real pleasure to get to speak here. Like Kate said, I grew up in Baytown, so I grew up, coming over here and getting to visit, and so it's fun to be able to talk about it and talk about some of these other buildings. I do want to start, because my boss would be upset with me if I didn't do this, with a little bit of a plug for the organization that I work for, Preservation Houston. You may not be familiar with us, but we are an independent historic preservation nonprofit organization that works not only in Houston, but in Harris County. So Houston and surrounding communities. We don't fix up buildings ourselves. We don't own any property, but our job is to educate people about the architecture and history around them, and to make it easy for people to do preservation. So we do programs of our own that are similar to what happened out here. We do walking tours around town. We give awards. There's a lot of fun stuff if you're interested in Houston's history and architecture. So please look us up if you're interested. We'd love to have you participate. And you could also be a member. That's as hard of a sell as I'm going to give you, but it is a possibility. So I'm here tonight to talk about Art Deco in Houston. And like Kate said, it may not be, Houston is not the first place that you think of when you think of Art Deco. You probably think of Chicago or New York or Miami or somewhere like that. And rightly so. Those cities are well known for their Art Deco architecture. Houston's not. Most of the buildings that were built in Houston were never in this style, but it's interesting to look at the buildings that we do have that are Art Deco to see what they say about Houston's perception of itself and kind of how the city was trying to change its image in the 1920s and 30s. Before we get into that, I want to start with a little bit about what Art Deco is, because you may be sitting there going, I have no idea what you're talking about. It is, and I'm not a big fan of putting words up on the screen, so this is the most reading you're going to have to do, but I thought that this was helpful. The thing to remember about Art Deco is it's not just architecture. It was a comprehensive design movement. So everything from fashion to industrial design to interior design, graphic design, building certainly, but it really could affect all areas of your life. A lot of people call it the first truly international design movement as well, and it is true. You can find Art Deco in pretty much every corner of the globe, sometimes done with regional influences, but everybody was kind of working from the same playbook. Our term Art Deco is not contemporary to the actual style. In the 20s and 30s, nobody would have called it that. They called it modern or modernistic or functional or 20th century, or they had a lot of words for it. Art Deco, the term that we use today, was actually coined in the 1960s to refer to this design period, and it's from the French term for decorative arts in general, and we'll come back to that in a second. You'll understand why. But when we talk about Art Deco, we're talking about a term that was invented 30 years later to describe a whole range of styles that took place in the 20s and 30s. It was popular in the U.S. from the mid-1920s, came to Texas a little bit later, got here around 1927. In most parts of the country, Art Deco was out of fashion by the time we entered World War II. In Texas, we were always kind of doing our own thing, so it was popular here for a little bit after the war till about 1950. In thinking about Art Deco architecture specifically, because the majority of what I'm going to be talking about is architecture, there are some basic elements to it that you'll see manifested in these buildings. Rich materials and textures, they were all about that, especially in the early days, but they were really interested in opulence and luxury when this movement started. Abstract detailing is really important. A lot of times they would base their detailing and their decoration on classical motifs or exotic designs, but they would always abstract them and tweak them and play with them a little bit. Integrated artwork was a big deal, and almost every building I'll show you has something, whether it's sculpture or reliefs or murals. They were always interested in integrating crafts and art into their designs. An embrace of technology, especially in the later period. They loved playing with new alloys of materials. Stainless steel kind of became a big deal in the Art Deco period, and aluminum, and so they were using that in interesting ways. Glass block was invented during this period, and they loved glass block. So anything new that came out, and acoustical tile, they also were crazy about that because that was a new technology at the time. A lot of things that we take for granted were new and exciting back then. And the thing to remember, all of this is designed for the machine age. They were thinking of this architecture and design as thoroughly modern. They would have told you, if they were standing here talking to you now, they were doing something that nobody had ever done before. And sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not, but they really saw this as a vote of confidence for the future for modern living as it was in the 1920s and 30s. So this Art Deco style, the threads of it started in Europe in the 1910s and early 20s, and it came from a variety of places. It started in nationalistic architecture, it started in Cubist art, it started in a fascination with Morocco and Egypt and the Orient, and they were kind of bringing all these elements together. It sort of crystallized here in 1925 at the International Exposition of Decorative Arts in Paris. This was a World's Fair that was held for two main reasons. This was the years after World War I, and they wanted to show that the Allies, who had been victorious in World War I, were strong and were projecting confidence in the post-war years. They also wanted to reestablish France as a center of taste and luxury in the years after World War I because they had gone through a period of austerity and rationing and shortages after the war. So they were really trying to show, not only is the Allied countries back, but Paris is where you should be looking for all this. So this World's Fair was all about modernity. They would allow nothing but modern architecture and art, and it was also focused on luxury and opulence because they really wanted to usher in this post-war sense of the Belle Epoque that had come before the war. It's hard to tell from any overview of the fairgrounds, but everything here was designed in kind of varying degrees of Art Deco, and you saw everything from what was being built in the mid-20s to what would come later in the 30s. Some countries and some groups were doing things that were very modern. The U.S., interestingly enough, was invited to participate in this fair. We declined. It was the decision of the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover said, "We're not going to do this because we don't have modern art in the United States." I don't know if Herbert Hoover is the guy you'd go to for your art criticism, but he may have had a point. I don't know. It was an interesting example of the one time when America was not, charging in and going, yeah, we're really good at this. We didn't send an official delegation, but we did send, the government sent a party of artists and architects to observe what was going on and report back and say, this is what's happening. More importantly than that, though, hundreds of American architects and designers and journalists and department store buyers went and saw what was happening here and brought those ideas back to the United States. And so that's how Art Deco made the transition over to the U.S. It spread across the country pretty quickly thanks to a variety of things. Buildings were a big way, especially high-profile Art Deco projects like the Empire State Building and Rockefeller Center in New York. These were buildings that you saw in magazines and newspapers and newsreels and movies, and everybody was familiar with them, and they were beautiful and tall and optimistic, and every city kind of wanted a version of one of these buildings. There were also magazines, which really leaned into Art Deco graphic design. Vogue, as you would expect, was one of the early ones to pick up on this, but it wasn't just fashion magazines. Fortune, the business magazine, was also known for its bold Art Deco covers, so it showed up in places you wouldn't expect. The 1930s were the golden age of World's Fairs and expositions. Chicago had a big Art Deco World's Fair in this decade. New York and San Francisco did as well. And then there were smaller expositions in San Diego, Dallas, Cleveland, Rochester. So a lot of Americans had the chance to go to these glitzy Art Deco fairgrounds and see all this design and really be impressed by it and want to bring it back home. And of course, the movies were a big influence here. Think about how many times you saw Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dance through an Art Deco nightclub, or when Flash Gordon would get into a rocket ship that looked like a streamlined vacuum cleaner and take off. But all of this, Americans were going to the theater week after week after week and seeing this design, and it was reinforcing it as an idea of glamour and modernity. This still is from Lost Horizon, 1938, which had some of the most fantastic Art Deco sets of any movie, but there are countless movies that really kind of like I said, reinforced this and gave you kind of increasingly spectacular examples of the style. So coming back to architecture, because Art Deco as we know it is a blanket term that came along later, it's really describing three distinct styles of American architecture that are under this umbrella. Zigzag moderne here on the left was the earliest Art Deco style that emerged in the late 1920s and was popular until the onset of the Depression. A very vertical style, very opulent, very luxurious, very highly ornamented. We'll talk about that in a second. When the Depression hit, most construction ground to a halt, and a lot of the construction that was done in the U.S. was government financed through the PWA and the WPA New Deal programs. And the government wanted to make sure we knew they were being responsible with our money. So they didn't do these super opulent buildings. They stripped things back and kind of went to this modified, modern, classical style that we would now call PWA and WPA Deco. And then on the right is the thing that's not like the others. Streamlined moderne, which became popular in the mid-30s and stayed popular until after World War II. This was a completely different thing. This was a style that was supposed to project optimism coming out of the Depression. So they wanted to show you their view of what the future would look like. And they wanted these buildings to be very clean and modern and kind of make you feel like it was a vote of confidence for a post-Depression society. These buildings, these streamlined buildings, took their cues from industrial design. If you think about streamlined airplanes, ocean liners, trains, things like that, you can see a lot of commonalities between those and the buildings that were being built. So we'll get to all these styles, but I want to start with zigzag moderne. This is kind of jazz age architecture, if you want to think about it that way. Like I said, this was the first wave. It was what was popular between about 1927 and say 1932, when the Depression really took hold in the United States. We don't have a lot of examples of really high zigzag design in Houston, not because we didn't have the money to build it, but because in the late 1920s, Houston was still very into Mediterranean architecture. Rice University had opened in 1912, and it had prompted this whole wave of Spanish and Mediterranean style buildings. So if you were going to put money into a building, chances are it was going to be something like the Edison Library downtown, like a very fancy Spanish or Mediterranean style, rather than something like this. Unless you were Jesse Jones, who was Houston's most powerful banker and businessman. He wanted a statement building for his growing real estate portfolio, and he wanted a new headquarters for his National Bank of Commerce. So he decided he was going to build the most modern building in town. And luckily, our biggest example of zigzag deco is also one of the best examples that I know of in this part of the country and maybe nationwide of the style. Jones hired his preferred architect, Alfred Finn, who also designed this building, to do the Gulf building here. It was not only the tallest building in Houston when it opened in 1929, but the tallest building in the South at 36 stories, 450 feet, and it remained the tallest building in town until 1963. So this was really the kind of the exclamation point on Houston's skyline. It has all the elements of, a 1920s jazz age skyscraper. The vertical emphasis, it was a tall building, but everything about the design was supposed to make it seem taller and was supposed to draw your eye up. It also has setbacks, and you can see how the building steps back to a crown. This was a design element that came out of New York. New York started requiring its buildings to step back in the 1910s to allow light and air to come down to the street. Houston didn't have that problem, but like every city, we wanted to look like New York, so we designed buildings with setbacks too, and it just became the standard profile of this era of skyscraper. Alfred Finn was basing his design on, well, like I said, he would have told you that he was doing something completely new and completely modern and something that had no historical precedent. I would tell him that it kind of looks like a Gothic bell tower, because I think it does. Also, he may not have been thinking about real historical precedent, but there was a precedent for his design. The Gulf building, of course, here on the left in the 1950s. On the right is an unbuilt design for the Chicago Tribune Tower by Eliel Saarinen, a Swedish-American architect. They look pretty similar, I think. Saarinen's design was done in 1922. It came in second in the design competition for the Tribune Tower, but it got the most attention of any design. It was widely published. People thought it was fantastic. A lot of people kind of wish that it had been built. I have to think Finn was I mean, I know he was aware of this design. I have to think he was influenced by it. If you need a little bit more convincing, if you take the top off the Tribune Tower, my gosh, they sure do look similar, don't they? It's not to take anything away from Finn's design, but it does show you he might have claimed he was groundbreaking, but he was actually influenced by several things. Inside, the building is just as opulent as it is on the outside. I mentioned it was the headquarters of Jesse Jones's bank. It is still a bank. Chase Bank is the corporate successor to the National Bank of Commerce, and they still use this space as their banking hall. Although banking ain't what it used to be, but you can still go bank in a grand place. The floor is terrazzo, done in these abstract geometric patterns. The walls look like marble, but they're actually polished limestone, and the ceiling is gold leaf. That center part of the ceiling was originally a skylight, but it was built over at some point, so it became an artificial light. But really a kind of glamorous space that would have transported you, if you can imagine coming in off the street in 1929 and stepping in here. It would have seemed like you were banking in Oz, maybe. The building lobby itself has this fantastic ceiling that also shows off some of these zigzag design elements. And you can really see why they called it zigzag deco. Everything here is very angular. There's a lot of literal zigzags in it. But this plaster ceiling has floral designs. It has lightning bolts. It has these rays and stars. And it's all just, it's layer on layer and texture on texture. This is not the original paint scheme, by the way. It was originally painted in different metallic shades, so all those designs would have stood out a little bit more than they do now. The metalwork throughout the building was custom designed for the project and was done by the Gorham foundry that's well-known silversmiths. This is not silver, it's nickel, but it's really spectacular Art Deco metalwork. This is just a panel that's over one of the doors, but the elevator doors, the mailboxes, doorknobs, everything in the lobby is done to this level of design. And when we talk about integrated artwork, it's not just figures like this. There's actual literal integrated artwork in this building. They hired a muralist named Vincent Miragliotti, who was a traveling frescoist, if you can believe it. Everybody's got to have a job. He did a series of 8 frescoes in the building lobby that show scenes from the history of Texas, and they end with his conception of modern Houston in 1929. I guess there really were like gauchos and flappers hanging out together with their pet wolf. I don't know what was going on. But you can see the Gulf building is the tallest building on the skyline. It's under attack by blimps and biplanes, which they don't talk about in history. But there are oil wells, there's the ship, there's, let's see, it's a little, oh, here's Rice University. I think this was the old Coliseum. So there's a lot happening here that's showing you, his conception of modern Houston. These are real frescoes, by the way, painted on wet plaster on the wall, and are pretty spectacular. Miragliotti went on to do all of the lobby painting in the Waldorf Astoria in New York. So he's a pretty big deal. One of the big tenants in the building, besides the bank and Gulf Oil, was Sakowitz Department Store. It occupied the first 6 floors of the building, and this was their main sales floor when you'd come in off Main Street. A pretty spectacular space. The architecture of the space was done by Alfred Finn, but the actual store design was by a company out of, I think, Chicago called Taussig and Flesch they were known for upscale department stores. Unfortunately, none of this interior design survives. The space does, but the light fixtures and the cases and all of that are gone. But you can imagine it was a pretty glamorous place to shop. And this design carried throughout the store. This on the left is the men's shirt department. On the right is, I think, the ladies' shoe department. But what these pictures don't tell us, unfortunately, is how colorful it was. There would have been a lot of metallics here, a lot of gold and silver, a lot of rich colors. The floors in here are the same kind of green shades that they are in the banking hall, and everything would have played off that, but must have been a pretty spectacular place. It's interesting to think retail was actually one of the places that you saw the highest level of design, because upscale stores wanted you to feel that you were in a luxurious environment when you came in to buy. So Sakowitz certainly embraced that. There were other stores that did too. This drawing on the left kind of looks like the shoe department at Sakowitz on the right, but it's not. This was one of the shoe departments at Krupp and Tuffley, which was another Main Street retailer. Krupp's was a big shoe and accessory store a little bit further down Main, but really embraced that same style. They built a new home for themselves in 1929, which Alfred Finn also designed. This was the exterior of that building. And you can see it's like mini version of the Gulf building with a lot of the same elements, the zigzags and the vertical emphasis and all of that. So it just goes to show you this style could be applied to small buildings as well as tall skyscrapers. I like the flappers who were waiting to cross the street too. This is at the corner of Main and Walker, and I just wanted to mention it's still there, although a lot of people don't realize it. Krupp and Tuffley remodeled their store in 1964 by covering it in white marble panels because that was the fashion in 1964. They air conditioned it. They didn't want all those pesky windows, so they just covered it and made it look like a marble box. The building burned in the fall of 2019, and so today this is what it looks like. On the right, there's marble under that mural, but on the left, the 1929 side of the building is exposed. We're keeping tabs on this one because we would love to see the rest of that taken down and the building returned to its original appearance. And, you know, I'm optimistic that it might be. It's still there, which is a really good sign. As long as it's there, somebody can work with it. At this period in the late 20s, it wasn't just about doing these super opulent zigzag buildings. They were also really fascinated with pulling in exotic designs and ancient designs and working them for the modern age. So this building is the Petroleum Building, 1927. This is widely considered to be the first Art Deco skyscraper in Houston. And it is and it isn't, and I'll come to that in a second. But it was designed by a British architect named Alfred Bossum, who trained in England, came over and worked in the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century, and then went back to England. But while he was here, he did several skyscrapers. And Bossum was all in on the Art Deco form and the setbacks and the whole bit. But he thought the best form for an American skyscraper was a Mayan pyramid, because he said, well, you've got, you know, this Spanish heritage throughout the southern United States. The Mayans were building buildings kind of like this, you know, thousands of years ago, so why shouldn't we do it too? So Bossum was showing off his Mayan skyscraper ideas in the Petroleum Building here. And this is the interesting thing. It has an Art Deco profile, and you can see with those setbacks and everything, but then when you get up close and really start looking at the details are Mayan and Mesoamerican, but they're also not. They're a British architect's 1920s version of what Mayan and Mesoamerican detailing would have looked like. So they're cool. They're not authentic, but that doesn't really matter. The reason that this is Art Deco is because, again, it's all about abstraction. And it looks very Mayan to me. If you showed this to an actual Mayan, they would go, what are you doing? Because what look like hieroglyphics are not really hieroglyphics. The faces don't have anything to do with history. But I think it's interesting that this was the way that Bossum chose to represent kind of his version of the style that we saw in the Gulf building a second ago. And again, very rich, very opulent, lots of layers, lots of texture happening here, but just kind of with a different emphasis. One of my favorite things about the Petroleum Building, and by the way, this building does still exist. It's now a hotel close to Minute Maid Park on Texas Avenue. Around back, the building had a attached parking garage, which was a big deal for 1927. And Bossum covered it with detailing too, including this guy who kind of matches the grotesque that are on the rest of the building, except he's wearing a 1920s driving hat and driving goggles because he's on the parking garage. So why not? He looks terrified. I don't know if he didn't know how to drive. I'm not sure what was going on. Movie theaters were a place that you really saw this exotic deco influence on full display. Houston had three what they called atmospheric theaters downtown that were all representative of different eras in history. And some of you may remember these. The Majestic was designed to look like you were watching a movie in an Italian garden. The Low State was this very beautiful French design. And then the Metropolitan was really tapping into another 1920s deco trend, which was Egyptian design. You didn't get it from the sidewalk. You had a pretty traditional theater marquee and a lot of flashing lights and ticket booths and signs advertising that you could be cool inside. They were proud of that. But then when you stepped through the doors, you went from Main Street, Houston, into, I don't even know what, a 1920s Art Deco version of King Tut's tomb, maybe. And you do have to keep in mind, this theater opened in 1926, 4 years after King Tut's tomb was opened. So this whole Egyptian fad was in full swing at this time. On the left here is the foyer you would have come in from Main Street, and on the right, I think, is one of the mezzanine lobbies. But every surface, the architect Alfred Finn covered in Egyptian detail, but again, not authentic Egyptian detail. It was a 1920s stylized Art Deco Hollywood version of Egyptian detail, which is very cool. One of my favorite things is the zigzags that you see here and over here. They were done in tile, and they would have been really colorful. Nothing to do with Egypt, but it looked great. The floor has like a mosaic of a pharaoh, and I mean, there's just a lot happening. All of this would have led you to the main auditorium, which I guess was supposed to look like you were seeing a movie with King Tut. But again, just every surface was lavished with detail. Again, highly stylized and abstracted, very opulent, very kind of tapping into this whole idea of exotic architecture. I really wish this or any of the other theaters were still there. They were all demolished in the early 1970s, all for parking lots, unfortunately. But wouldn't it be amazing if we had kept one of them? My favorite view of the Metropolitan is this. It's a little niche where you could go get a drink of water, but even that has a bunch of Egyptian detail in it, along with a couple of Art Deco water fountains. But I think my favorite is this chorus line of sun gods up here, which did not actually happen in Egyptian design, but it happened in the 1920s. So I mentioned when the Depression hit and the government started funding construction, they really wanted to dial all this excess back because they didn't want to look like they were wasting taxpayer dollars on buildings that look like the ones we had just seen. So this PWA and WPA Deco style came into vogue. It was stripped back to its basic elements, still a modern interpretation of classical architecture, but without a lot of the excesses of the late 1920s. Architects themselves were not super excited about this because they thought it was really limiting their scope, and it became popular for architects to call it starved classicism. And that's kind of an interesting way to think about it because that's sort of what they were doing. One of the best examples of this in Houston is Houston City Hall, built in 1939. It was funded with a PWA grant, so there was federal money that went into this. A very symmetrical, balanced, classical composition. And you can see it has that same vertical emphasis that we saw in the Gulf building. It makes the building look taller than it is. It's only 10 stories, but it always feels to me like it wants to be a lot taller than that. But you've got the wings, you've got the nice balance, you've got, kind of restrained detailing. Just a very responsible, a little bit more sober government-funded building. It does still have artwork and detail. This is one of the main entrances with beautiful metalwork and sculpture. So it was supposed to, kind of impress you when you were walking in. They didn't want to make it look like the city didn't have any money. They just wanted to make it look like they were spending the money they had in a more responsible fashion. The details here are all still intact and are all great. That up at the top left is one element of that screen that you just saw over the entrance doors. It shows in aluminum cameos of different lawgivers through history. So this is Thomas Jefferson up here. The light fixtures in the city council chamber are really nice examples of deco design. The signage up there, the water department is no longer in the building, but they kept that etched glass sign that was original in 1939. And then the sculpture down here is the sculpture that's over both of the principal entrances to the building. They loved allegory in the 1920s and 30s. So these are two allegorical dudes taming a horse, and they represent the law, and the horse is human nature. So the idea is you're bending human nature to the will of the law, which is kind of grim if you think about it, but anyway. There were also murals inside the lobby done by an artist from Kansas City named Daniel McMorris. Two murals that represent the law and culture, and this is the culture mural, which I think is a little bit more interesting, but he's kind of painting it and lighting it to make it look like it's a 3D relief, even though it's not, but they're really beautiful, and they are literally on the ceiling, so when you walk in, you've got to look completely overhead to see them. The centerpiece of the lobby ceiling is this. It's a relief that was done by, all of the sculpture on the building was done by Dallas artist Raul José working with Beaumont sculptor Herring Co. And I'm not sure exactly how they collaborated on this, but this was part of their work. It is the signs of the zodiac surrounding the globe. And if you look at the way the globe is positioned, Texas is in the middle and Houston is at the very center, which is just as it should be. So that's nice to see. Another big WPA project or PWA project in Houston is one that a lot of people don't expect, the University of Houston campus. U of H was donated the land for its current campus in 1936 and brought in Kansas City landscape architects Hare and Hare to do a master plan for the campus using WPA funding. What Hare and Hare envisioned was a campus of kind of low-rise Art Deco buildings surrounding a series of lawns and quadrangles in a very kind of orderly, Beaux-Arts classical kind of composition. If you know U of H, you know this is not the way that it turned out. The university grew by leaps and bounds after World War II, and it became necessary to build much bigger buildings kind of wherever they could. So they, in the 60s, they had just gotten to the point where they were like, whatever, we'll just put this there and build a 10-story thing here. And so it didn't work out like Hare and Hare had envisioned, but if you know where to look on the U of H campus, you can still see remnants of this. The main quadrangle is here in the Hare and Hare plan, and it does still exist after a fashion. This building, the Roy Cullen Memorial, is the first building to be completed on the campus from 1939, and it's on that main quad, and it does conform to the Hare and Hare plan, designed by Lamar Cato, a Houston architect, and it's, you know, again, kind of that restrained, dialed back sort of architecture, not as opulent as what we had seen, but based in classicism. You do see glass block coming in here, which is something we haven't seen before. The really interesting thing about the U of H buildings is, I mentioned early on, Houston had long had this fascination with Mediterranean architecture, so Cato combined Art Deco design with Mediterranean red tile roofs, which you do not usually see, but it works here, and it gives U of H a pretty distinctive look. There's another building facing this one across the quadrangle, the Science Building, also from 1939, which was PWA funded. The Cullen Memorial was funded by Hugh Roy Cullen as a monument to his son, who had died in an oil field accident a few years earlier. And at the head of this quadrangle is one of the latest Art Deco buildings in Houston, the Ezekiel Cullen building, also funded by a gift from Hugh Roy Cullen. This was designed by Alfred Finn, and it's 1950. So this was about as late as you could get away with building Art Deco, but Finn was still working in a pretty strong Art Deco mode here, partly because he wanted to match the other buildings that were around it, but also partly because a new style of architecture really hadn't developed in the United States by that time. We got out of the war, we started building in the late 40s and early 50s, and we hadn't really had time to think about what was going to come next. It wouldn't be until a few years later that we really got into what became the international style or mid-century architecture. If you know the Ezekiel Cullen building, you know there's a lot more of it than you can see in this picture. It's a very long, very massive building, but this is kind of the centerpiece in the big entrance. Now, in the midst of all this, in the middle of the Depression, came Texas Centennial, the 100th anniversary of our independence from Mexico. And Texas saw this as a chance to celebrate, obviously, but also as a chance at economic stimulus, because 1936 was the depth of the Depression. A lot of Texans were in really bad shape. The kind of powers that be started thinking, what can we do not only to celebrate, but to put people to work and to try to drive tourism here, because we could advertise Texas as a place that you should come. There was a statewide Centennial Commission, and they brought in Jesse Jones because he was probably the most powerful man in Texas at the time. And it turned out Jones's vision of the Centennial differed from what the Centennial Commission's vision of the Centennial did. The Commission was really interested in having a big party. They wanted a central exposition where people could come and they could really celebrate and whoop it up and have, spend a lot of money. Jones thought that the Centennial should be celebrated in a more sober way. And he did have a point. He said, okay, we can have a big party, but what is going to be left when the party is over? And he said, is it appropriate to celebrate the sacrifices of the Texan pioneers with, dancing girls and burlesque and cotton candy and whatever? It turned out they could do both, and they did. The Centennial Exposition was held in Dallas in 1936. I just want to take a quick diversion to Dallas to point out one of the results of it was the reconstruction of Fair Park in Dallas into what is today one of the largest collections of related Art Deco art and architecture in the world. It's also the only 1930s fairground that survives anywhere in the world mostly intact. And it's an incredible place, and I'd be happy to come back and tell you about it sometimes. My presentation on Fair Park includes midgets and strippers, so if that's not an enticement, I don't know what is. No midgets and strippers tonight, I'm sorry. We just have the San Jacinto Monument. This is, so the Centennial Exposition in Fair Park was the kind of party aspect of the Centennial. The San Jacinto Monument really embodies Jesse Jones's more sober, kind of monumental commemoration of the Centennial. What Jones wanted was monuments in every corner of the state that could remind people of our history. So as part of the Centennial Project, something was built in every county in Texas. It might have just been one historical marker. It might have been a larger monument or a museum. Of course, here in Jesse Jones's hometown, we got one of the coolest things of all. This monument on the site where Texas won its independence, the tallest masonry monument in the world. And depending on who you ask, they pulled a little bit of trickery on the people in Washington and measured it in a way that makes it taller than the Washington Monument. Anyway, that's a story for another time. But this was Jesse Jones's concept. He really wanted this kind of monument. It was funded with New Deal money and designed by Alfred Finn. So it was kind of a combination of a lot of the forces that we've talked about so far. It follows the basic design that you would have seen in a lot of monuments. It's somebody described it as the Lincoln Memorial with the Washington Monument on top of it, which kind of. It's based on an Egyptian obelisk or kind of victory column, maybe from ancient Rome, similar to the Washington Monument, except this one has a little bit of Art Deco or modern flair with these kind of channels that run up the side. So it's and the cutaway corners also give it a little bit of 1930s look. It also has some abstraction on it because we've talked about that being a big element. The running detail around the base of the building is this like shell or wave design, which is probably a reference to the monument being close to the ship channel and close to Galveston Bay, but also just a nice abstract, neither here nor there kind of detail. Inside, it's hard to get a sense of this today because there is stuff in the building, but when these pictures were taken before dedication, you really got a sense of what they were trying to do. And they were trying to make this a really monumental building where you walked in and it had this sober kind of monumental feel. And you can get a sense of that through the architecture and the proportions here. And they had to bring in these strategically placed uplights just to... you can see, if you look over here, they hadn't installed the light fixtures yet, so I think that was the only way they could get the lights in. There is integrated artwork here, courtesy of a sculptor named William McVeigh, a prominent sculptor working in Houston at the time. He did this band of reliefs around the base of the monument that show scenes from the Texas Revolution interspersed with scenes from early Texas, but done in a very kind of figural, stylized Art Deco way that are very, very cool. And McVeigh also had a hand in helping to plan the crowning feature of the monument, the star, which they had a really hard time with. They went through different designs and tried to figure out what to put on top of the monument, and there was thought that it should be a soldier, and there was the thought that it should be an eagle, and then they settled on a star, and Alfred Finn thought, well, we can put like a cutout of a star up there, and somebody pointed out, yeah, that's great when you see it from the right side, but then when you look at it from the other side, it looks like a line. So they had to work out how to do a 3D star that could be seen from any angle, and the story of that is pretty interesting. They ended up doing a scale model mock-up and figured out exactly how it would have to look. But it's an interesting crown to an interesting monument. You know, everybody is aware of it, but how many times do you actually stand and look at the building? And maybe we need to do a little bit more of that. You saw the Centennial and Texas Pride pop up in other places as well. Lamar High School in Houston was one of the city's showplace high schools built in the 1930s, also PWA funded. It was designed by Kenneth Fransheim and John Staub, kind of a streamlined building, which we'll get to in a second, but very modern, sort of futuristic looking school. And then over the auditorium, they remembered it was the Centennial, so they stuck a giant relief map of Texas, which I really like, but they also reminded us that the construction started in 1936, and it's just this kind of weird touch that doesn't have anything to do with the rest of the building, but I'm happy that it's there. A little bit of Texas pride for you. So coming into this last phase of Art Deco design, streamlined modern, it is exactly what it sounds like. It was streamlined architecture. Remember I mentioned earlier, it took a lot of cues from industrial design and the design of fast planes and trains and ocean liners. Like I said, this was supposed to project a futuristic image and an optimistic image coming out of the Depression. This is one of the best examples of it that we have, the Houston Municipal Airport Terminal from 1940, designed by Joseph Finger, the same architect who did Houston City Hall the year before. The flat stucco walls here are very typical of this streamlined design. Curves are something that we have not seen much of so far, but curves are all over the place in streamline. And also you can see in the windows here, this has a much more sort of industrial, the windows almost look warehousey, but that was from that borrowing from, industrial steel windows versus like fancy figured brass windows or something that they might have done in the late 1920s. The interior of the building was not super opulent, but had good materials and kind of reflected this idea of the modernity of air travel. Again, very simple kind of flat plaster surfaces, terrazzo floor, little bit of detailing, very nice deco furniture, and Humphrey Bogart look-alike over here waiting for a plane. That's not really him, is it, Amy? Okay, no. I figured if it was, we would know about it, but yeah, just a guy who they would put in pictures to make you think Humphrey Bogart was at the airport. The cool thing about this building is it went through a long period of neglect. It has been restored as the 1940 Air Terminal Museum, but it retained so much of its original detailing. The signage here, I think, is just sensational, and it's really kind of representative of, again, the graphic design of the era. These winged wheels that you see here were kind of very typical of transportation-related buildings. The building also has its share of integrated artwork, reliefs that show the history of air travel, from the Wright brothers plane on the left to a modern, for 1940, airliner on the right. And then my favorite element is Winged Mercury by Dwight Holmes, which is over the main entrances to the airport. It's a guy welcoming you to Houston, and nothing says welcome like a strategically placed plane. But again, they were really into allegory and they were really into classical sculpture, so that's what they're doing here. That should be on a postcard, really. You saw streamlined design used in industrial buildings a lot of the time because industrial concerns wanted to project this image of modernity and being up to date. The Clark and Courts printing building in kind of Greater Montrose in Houston is a nice example of this. This is Joseph Finger again from the late 1930s, but you can see the highly stylized lettering here that's built into the building, which is great. And then the sign over the door that advertises what the company did. All of that black metal work is original with the really stylized letters. The Tribeca Lofts is a new sign from the 1990s where they were kind of trying to emulate the style but not copy it. So that's the reason there's two different kinds of letters here. Grocery stores were surprisingly into streamlined design because supermarkets were a new thing in the 1930s. They had just invented the shopping cart, and the shopping cart made an actual full-service supermarket possible. Weingarten's, you probably remember, was one of our big supermarket chains. They hired Joseph Finger to design their prototype store, and so variations on this Weingarten store were built all over town. This one, I think, was on Fulton Street and is no longer there, but there are a few of these Weingarten buildings still around, and they've been messed with to varying degrees, but if you kind of keep your eye out for them, you can see them. More glass block here, and then this was all covered in neon, so the idea was at night you could see it from blocks around and you knew exactly where the store was. But you didn't have to be a supermarket to use this kind of design. This is one of my favorites. This little corner market, which was at Travis and Anita in Midtown, the Quality Market, built in 1937, and it is just one curve. It's nothing but stucco and a curve. But the newspaper, when this opened, said the family that ran it had started out with a meat stall in the city market downtown, and then by 1937, their dreams had been realized in stucco and chrome, and I think that's a really cool way to describe the building. Also, very stylized lettering on here, too. Unfortunately, this little building is long gone. I really wish it were still there, but did not survive. Transportation-related buildings, we talked about the airport, but car dealerships used streamlining because they were buildings full of streamlined cars, so why not have a streamlined car dealership too? Knapp Chevrolet is on Houston Avenue, built in 1941, designed by actually a couple of architects from the Valley who were working for the Knapp family that owned dealerships in Corpus in Houston. But you can see the same elements that we've talked about, the glass block, the neon signage, the curve. This picture is from the 70s, but the building really hadn't changed at that point from what it originally looked like. It has changed slightly now, but not all that much. It still looks very much like it did. Since this picture was taken, they've taken this awning down, so it actually looks a lot more like it would have in 1940. It's always interesting. These pictures take me back down memory lane myself, because that is the car that I sold in 2007. So that tells you how long ago I took this picture. Anyway, building is still there. Hadn't changed enough to go back and reshoot it. Another example of auto-related streamlining is the River Oaks Shopping Center from 1937. This was Houston's first kind of fully realized suburban car-oriented shopping center, and really was an innovative design in its time. It was designed by Houston architects Nunn and McGinty working with Oliver Winston from Washington, D.C., and they had to address this intersection of Shepherd here and West Gray, where it turned into Inwood and went into River Oaks. So what they decided to do was design the shopping center as just two curves on either side of the street. You had parking in front and in back, and there were breezeways so you could walk from one parking lot to another. But this was actually widely published across the country, and magazines said, this is going to be the way that we build shopping centers from now on, because this makes the most sense. And it was rarely, if ever, repeated. So apparently they were a little bit wrong about that, but it's a very cool design. Unfortunately, this half has been demolished and replaced with a new building, but this half is still there. One thing that did not survive over the years, you can see it in this picture, is dueling gas stations on either side of the street. But they wanted you to be able to buy gas no matter which way you were headed, so you could pull in from whatever direction you were going. One was a Gulf station and one was a Texaco. This is the Gulf station, which was on the south side of the street, and then the Texaco was over here. They were, for a time, replaced by dueling Starbucks, which is a commentary on our modern age. You don't see many Deco residential buildings in Houston. There were a few, but for the most part, Houstonians like to live in more traditional houses. Not everybody, though. This was the house built in 1935 for Virgil Childress and his wife. She was an art patron. He was, I want to say, a banker, but now suddenly I'm blanking on his profession. They hired a couple of young architects, Harvin Moore and Herman Lloyd, who had graduated from Rice from the architecture program just a few years before. And Moore and Lloyd were not afraid to be a little bit more daring in their designs than some of the older guard Houston architects were. So they designed for the Childresses a house that was very much up to date in 1935. You can see the streamlining, you can see the curve. Not a big house, but it's a house with a lot of style. One other thing I didn't mention, you didn't see it so much in the air terminal because that was a very symmetrical building, but in the Streamline era, they finally moved away from symmetry. Kind of leading up to that, they were always about balance and they were always about symmetry, but they became less concerned about that and more, I guess, a little bit jauntier later in the Streamline era. You can see more glass block here on either side of the door, and one kind of unique feature of this house, these frosted glass panels were actually done by Lalique. And a nice kind of geometric design with a rosette in the middle. This house burned a few years ago and was in danger of being completely lost. Luckily, they were able to get the fire before it got too far, and the owners restored it. They had already restored it once to bring it back to its original appearance. Then they restored it again after the fire. The original front doors were too damaged to repair, so they had new front doors made and salvaged these Lalique plaques, which is really nice to see, but that's the reason that they're cracked. They cracked from the heat of the fire. This is inside. This very kind of Hollywood dramatic living room with the mirrored fireplace and the backlit surround, which is all restored back to its original 1935 appearance. One thing that you can't see from this picture, which kind of fascinates me, there is this very Deco fireplace insert, because it was a gas fireplace. And around back, it came from Germany, and it's got the Nazi insignia on it because it came from 1935 Germany. Just an interesting historical reminder. One other really prominent house from this era is the Allen House on Bluebonnet in Braeswood. This was built in 1937, and was designed by architect Harold Calhoun. The Allens actually sent Calhoun and a friend of his to the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 to get ideas for this house. And they came back and incorporated a lot of what they saw into the final design. It looked like nothing else in Houston at the time, and the newspaper said people were lined up along the street to see the modernistic house and just drive by and get a look at it. We talked about glass block a little bit. Glass block was invented around 1934, 1935, and was kind of this wonder material because it allowed light in, but you didn't have to put up curtains because it still gave you privacy. So there's this big run of glass block here, which opens into the living room, and so you can see it allows you privacy, but without having to do window coverings. This house has also been really nicely restored, and the very cool thing about it is it still has some of the original furniture in it. This chair has always been with the house, and this built-in desk and chair are also original to 1937. I wanted to talk about a couple of building types just in closing that I couldn't figure out where else to put in the presentation, but they're things that that should be addressed. Movie theaters. We talked about the big downtown movie palaces earlier, but there were neighborhood movie theaters all over Houston, and a lot of them used Art Deco design. The River Oaks from 1939, designed by Pettigrew and Worley of Dallas, is the last one we have that is intact. It's not open right now. The River Oaks Theater closed a couple of years ago, but there are plans to restore it and open it back up as a movie theater, which I'm excited about. Inside, you can see kind of the elements that made this an Art Deco theater: the dramatic lighting, the rich colors, and really the only art in here is these reliefs on either side of the screen. Every movie theater would have had some kind of artwork in it, but it was unusual to see actual sculptural reliefs. What Pettigrew and Worley did here was to represent land and sea in these very kind of abstract ways. So this is sea on the left holding a fish, and that's land on the right holding a ram. But you can see this is kind of one of the things they really liked to do in Deco architecture was do dramatic lighting and dramatic color, and they really wanted it to look like it was this super high contrast, almost charcoal drawing, and so that's kind of the effect that you can see here. The Alabama Theater, kind of a few blocks away from the River Oaks, also designed in 1939, also by Pettigrew and Worley. I'm showing it to you even though it does not look like this anymore, but it's another good example of what a Art Deco neighborhood theater would have looked like. The Alabama closed in the 70s, or maybe early 80s, and was restored as Bookstop. And Bookstop, some of you probably remember going there. They took great care to keep the building exactly as it was, and at the time, they said, we wanted to keep this building so that it could be converted back to a movie theater if anybody ever decided to do that. Inside, they sold books on the floor of the auditorium, but when you looked up, it was still 1939. You can see here, instead of doing reliefs, they did murals that just kind of showed classical figures. But it was gorgeous in there. Bookstop closed. The landlords demolished a lot of the auditorium, hoping to attract a new tenant, which doesn't make any sense to me. They did attract a new tenant, Trader Joe's, and Trader Joe's actually kind of went back and did as much as they could to try to re-movie theater it. So it sort of looks like it looked, but it's too sad to show you a picture of now. Although I like Trader Joe's. Anyway, I'm conflicted when I go to buy eggs. But the eggs are $2.99, so I'm not that conflicted. Just up the street from here is another example of this, the Capitan in downtown Pasadena. This opened in 1949, designed by Raymond Smith, and was another nice example of a bigger, maybe not a neighborhood theater, but maybe this was more of what you'd call a community theater because it served the whole town of Pasadena. You can see again the striking sign, the marquee that would have been covered with neon to get your attention as you were passing by. Inside, the theme here was nautical because it was near the ship channel. So you had frolicking like nymphs and Poseidon and all this. On the ceiling, it's a little bit hard to see, but this was like a mermaid with a compass painted on the ceiling. So, you know, again, all this would have just been kind of exotic and glamorous when you went to see a movie. The Capitan, of course, is still there. It was in bad shape. This is the same view from about 10 years ago. And you can see there was water damage, but the murals were still somewhat intact. This had been a church at some point, and apparently they decided some of the nymphs were a little bit too frolicky, so they painted over them. Anyway, the idea was the city of Pasadena was going to restore it at some point as a performing arts center. Apparently those ideas petered out at some point, and they sold the building in 2014 to a private owner, and the marquee and the neon was all stripped, and I don't know what has happened inside, but I'm kind of afraid to look. This is a close-up view of the murals as they were, and hopefully still are, but you can see where there was something that was a little bit inappropriate up here, so they just got rid of it. I wanted to close with a couple more retail stores, and kind of a mixed bag here, but I just wanted to put them in because I'm sure they're places that you'll remember. The Sears on South Main, built in 1939. Everybody went here, right? This was designed by Nimmons Carr and Wright of Chicago, which was a firm that was doing a lot of design for Sears at the time. This is the way that most of us remember it. After a 1962 remodeling, when they tried to make it look ultra-modern by covering it in corrugated metal, which, whatever, they thought that the original design from 1939 was outdated and that no one would shop there if it still looked like that. This is what they covered up. Who would want to go there? But this was, again, a nice kind of streamlined, stucco, very modern-looking store. It was one of Sears's suburban flagship stores that they built in the late Depression. And the idea was to really show you what a store of the future could be like. It was air-conditioned, it had an auditorium, it had a cafe. All of the floors were connected by escalator, which was a really big deal in 1939. And it had these display windows that faced out to Main and Fannin. Sears closed a few years ago, and Rice University, which owned the building, remade this building as a tech incubator and kind of an innovation hub. They saved the walls of the building. They gave it a big hat. I'm glad that it's still there. They claim it's a restoration. I wouldn't say so. But, it's nice that they at least recognized it enough to uncover it, take that corrugated metal off, and somewhat restore the original part of the store here. One thing they didn't restore, which it may not have been possible to, the store had murals inside, because Sears, even Sears in the late 1930s, had an in-house muralist who would go around and decorate their stores. So the muralist was Eugene Montgomery out of Chicago. He painted, I think it was 12 or 13 murals of scenes from Houston history and Houston's present around the interior of the Sears. The murals may not survive. We tried to find out if they were still in there, but we never were able to. But what we have is color pictures that Montgomery took of them before they were installed. So the one on the bottom is the port. And what it shows, which I think is really funny, is the guy's coming up with the idea for the port, asking the government for money and getting it. That's what this is. And then the guy's working on the port over here. The money looks a lot like the bananas, but that must have been confusing. Up here, this top picture is a study. This is not the finished mural, but this was Montgomery's study for a view of modern Houston, which, if you think about the modern Houston we saw from the Gulf building, they're not that dissimilar. This one's a little bit less fanciful, but it's still got the skyline and it's still got all the industry and everything. We showed these to Rice and we said, wouldn't it be cool if you could recreate these? And they went, And I want to close with a lost building, but one that again, many of you will remember, Foley's. Their Main Street store that was built in 1947, maybe not what you would think of when you think of Art Deco, but this is the way that it looked in its later years, but this is how it looked when it opened, and it certainly was a big kind of modern box, but it definitely was borrowing from that Art Deco very dramatic design language. This side that faced Main Street was done in Casota stone, which is kind of a orange, warm limestone, but it had these setbacks and this gentle curve that gave it this really dramatic presence. The reason, of course, that the building was a big windowless box is because it was air-conditioned. It was an ultra-modern store that was kind of the last word in post-war elegance. And they made a big deal about how it didn't have any of those pesky windows that would keep you from displaying goods however you wanted. So the idea was everything inside was modular and you could move it around and you could display however you wanted. Didn't have to worry about things fading or whatever. It remained Foley's for a long time. Macy's eventually took Foley's over. And department stores are not what they used to be. So Macy's closed their downtown location a few years ago, and the building was demolished to make way for a new office building. Part of it does remain, though, which is the garage across Travis. This garage was built at the same time as the store, and it was part of the allure of Foley's because you had enclosed parking, and then you could go down into a tunnel and walk across the street to the store. And the most amazing thing to me is, in the early days when you bought stuff in Foley's, it would go onto this conveyor belt system and it would be taken over to the garage. And they said, at least in 1947, they could put it in your trunk. And so you could get in your car and like everything was already in there, which sounds a little weird to me, but it was a different time. But at the very least, they had a package pickup over there, and so you could pick up everything you bought. I've heard stories about, apparently you could see the conveyor belt going by in the tunnel, so you could like race your packages over to the, or you thought you were anyway. The store was torn down, but kind of in true Houston fashion, we recognized the true value, which was the parking garage. So you can still go park in the Foley's garage if you want to. I want to close with one more shot from City Hall. And this is kind of an interesting sentiment, considering that I showed you a couple of buildings that have been mangled and torn down. But this is a quote from an architectural historian, John Ruskin, or a paraphrase of a quote. And it's something that Joseph Finger chose to put in the lobby of City Hall. As we build our city, let us think that we are building forever. And I think it's an interesting sentiment in Houston because we don't think that way very often. But I do like that Finger was thinking about this, because I do think the common thread of all these buildings, whether it was a little corner grocery store or a big skyscraper, it was a vote of confidence in Houston. It was trying to remake Houston in this modern image. We had just gotten to be the biggest city in the state. We were on our way to being one of the biggest cities in the country, and they wanted to show we were no backwater. We were doing the same quality of stuff that was being done in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. And it's just interesting to think about these buildings as a reminder of this time when Houston was going from kind of regional city to big city, from state player to national player, becoming an energy capital, and really thinking about how we were going to project ourselves. We didn't want to be the old South anymore. We wanted to be the modern West, and that's what these buildings were really trying to show. Kate did a great job of plugging this earlier, but I will remind you there is a book, Houston Deco, which has these and many more buildings in it. The book actually covers the upper coast all the way from Houston to Beaumont, so there's a lot more within driving distance that you can see. And I will say, my co-author David and I are working on a revision to Houston Deco. I don't know when it's going to be done, hopefully while we're still alive. But it's going to become a bigger and more detailed book with a lot more historic photos in it. So it's not a reason to forego the copy that's available now, because a lot of what's in here is gone and won't be in the next version. But anyway, something to keep an eye out for in the future. Well, thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.